Okay, and the issue that the reason why we want to provide the new theory because we want to have a better explanation about the success and the failure, right? I mentioned in the past that the new the structuralism should be able to explain how come the developing country they could not have as high income as high income country. The explanation seems to be right, but you follow that you fail, right? And neoliberalism also. But the structuralism or neoliberalism could not explain how come some country was successful, right? They can explain how come some country failed, but they cannot explain how come some country was successful. Because this successful country, their policy seem to be violating their teaching, right? Okay. And then according to the Growth Commission, led chaired by Michael Spence, the Nobel Prize winners, they studied about 200 developing economies after the Second World War. And among them, 13 economies achieved 7% or more growth rate for 25 years or more. And high-income countries in general, they grow at about 3% to 3.5%. So if you can grow at 7% or more, that means you double or triple the growth rate as the high-income country. And for 25 or more years, if you do that, certainly you can sharply narrow your gap with the high-income country. So they were considered as a successful country. Among these successful countries, they have 5 common, characteristics or status facts. They are open economy, they have macro stability, they have high savings and high investment, they are market economy or move toward market, or they have competent, credible, and proactive government. And after the research, released in 2008, Michael Spence was invited to give lectures to meet head of states. And they asked, well, this kind of research seems to be very enlightening. Then, those politicians asked Michael Spence, well, how can we implement that? Is there a recipe for us to follow? And then Michael Spence said, well, those 5 dimensions are the ingredients for success. But they're not recipes. But without recipe, how can people follow? Right? If there's no recipe, how can people follow? This is a question, right? But I think that Michael Spence could not find a recipe because he did not study new structural economics. Actually, there's a recipe. And the recipe is that according to the new structural economics, to be successful, you need to follow your competitive advantage determined by your factor endowments now, right? Because that's the best way to change your factor endowments, to change your competitive advantages, right? But if you want to, follow your competitive advantages, you need to have some institutional conditions, preconditions. One is market economy, in order to provide right price signal to entrepreneur, right? And you also need to have a facilitation state in order to overcome the coordination failures in the process of economic development. Those are exactly the ingredients 4 and the ingredients 5 of new structural economics, right? And if you follow your comparative advantage, certainly you will be an open economy, right? You produce whatever you're good at, export that, and you import whatever you're not good at, and then trade will be important in your growth. And compared to countries follow the structuralism, import substitution strategies, then your import will be larger than them, And if they follow the import substitution strategies, they will replace the sector which they have comparative advantage, so their export will be reduced. So by comparison, it will be open. And so that's the condition number one. That will be the result, right? Secondly, if you follow your competitive advantages, then you will be competitive. Certainly, you are going to have less homegrown prices. And your government should have a very healthy fiscal position because the growth rate will be high, government revenue will be high, and not only so, you don't have to subsidize firms, and so fiscal position will be strong. If you have some kind of external shocks, then the government will be in a better position to have counter-cyclical intervention. So compared to the alternative, you are going to have much better mental stability, right? So that's condition number two. And if you follow your competitive advantages, I already explained, you're going to have largest possible economic surplus. You're going to have the highest possible return to investment. So under the kind of situation, certainly you're going to have high rate of savings and a high rate of investment. Condition number three. So in fact, there are recipes. And I'd like to report to you, this March, I'm joining a session in Beijing together with Michael Smith. And I explained this observation, this analysis in the same forum that he participated. So he listened very carefully. And at the end, he agreed with me. And so we had a new Institute of New Structural Economics. We set up International Advisory Board, and I invited him to be an advisor to sit on the board. He immediately agreed. Yeah. So there's a recipe. And this recipe can explain the success, right? In the past, when you have some success, you cannot explain how come there's success. Because in the past, the policy adopted by the successful country were considered as the wrong policy, right? But here we explain the reason why they are successful. They are successful. But we also explain how come the structuralism failed. So structuralism, if you read its logic, seems to be very conventional, but they failed. And the reason why the structuralism failed, because they failed to recognize economic structure is endogenous to the economic structure. They only see the linkage between income and the industrial structure. Certainly, if you want to have high income, you should have advanced, capital-intensive, technologically advanced industry. If you want to have high income, they see the linkage between income and industrial structure. But they did not recognize the industrial structure itself is endogenous to the endowment structure. In a low-income country, capital is scarce. Under the kind of situation, you do not have competitive advantages in capital-intensive industries. Firms were not viable, right? Remember the term viability. Firms were not viable in an open competitive market. Since they are not viable, even if you have no more management, you cannot make no more profit. Entrepreneurs will not go there, right? Because they are not profitable. So what observed is a market value. Actually, it's not market value. Markets function well. The market cannot, guide the resources allocation to those kind of industry only because they go against your competitive advantages. But they fail to see the linkage between endowment structure and the industrial structure. So they recommend the government to allocate resources directly to make investment in those kind of sectors that cause all kinds of distortions. Since the firms are not viable, the government would have to subsidize them. right? And the government subsidy and protection certainly led to misallocation of resources, away from sector which you have comparative advantage to sector you do not have comparative advantages. And the government intervention certainly caused all kind of rent seeking, corruption, and political capture, right? And according to structuralism, the strategy adopted in the East Asian economy was wrong because they started with some kind of traditional small-scale labor-intensive industries. But according to new structural economics, their strategies was right. Because those kind of sectors are consistent with your competitive advantages. With the government helps facilitation to overcome infrastructure or some kind of institutional issues, you can turn those kind of sectors from competitive advantages to very competitive sectors. And with that competitiveness, you can accumulate capital, right? And then you can accumulate capital fast, and you can upgrade your industry fast. And for developing countries follow this approach, they can have some kind of another advantage. That is latecomers advantage. Because for a developing country, in the process of industrial upgrading, technology innovation, they can learn from the more advanced country. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And under that, the cost and the risk of technology innovation in that would be much lower compared to high-income countries. They will have to invent the new technology industry by themselves. And so you can have a much faster rate of technology innovation and industrial upgrading. By that, certainly your economic growth rate will be much faster than a high-income country. And then you can close the gap. So this theory can explain the values and also the success, right? And this theory can also explain how come the Washington Consensus also failed. Again, Washington Consensus seems to be very conventional, especially for anyone receiving any modern economic education. The Washington Consensus, based on neoliberalism, say the developing country will fail because of too many government intervention cause all kinds of distortions, misallocation of resources, and rent seeking, corruption, and so on. But they fail to recognize that those kind of distortions themselves are endogenous to the need of protect the older capital-intensive large-scale industries, right? Because large-scale industry went against your comparative advantage without protection and subsidies, they will go bankrupt. But neoliberalism only see the distortions. They did not understand the distortion itself are endogenous. Okay? And under this, the Washington Consensus recommend remove of those kind of distortions. What would be the result? Without protection and subsidies, those kind of large-scale oil industry all go bankrupt, right? Will all go bankrupt, right? Cause large-scale unemployment. And then you have large-scale unemployment to happen, in a very short period of time, you're going to have social political instability. And then without social political stability, how can you grow your economy? That's one issue. Sometimes some of those kind of industries, you cannot afford to allow them to go bankrupt because they related to the national defense. Without those kind of large-scale capital-intensive industry, you cannot produce weapons. Without weapons, you cannot protect your own country. That is exactly what happened in Ukraine today. They used to be able to produce air carriers. They used to be able to produce nuclear weapons. They could produce the largest air carrier, airplane. But after the transition, they gave up all of that. Today, they cannot protect their own borders. Most countries will not do that. Most countries, they will continue to provide some subsidies and protection to those kind of national defense industries, even after the privatization. But after the privatization, the result can be even worse. Because those kind of industry, you would have to give them subsidy and protections because they are not viable. And the private sectors will have higher incentive for rent seeking than they're still under the state owned. And also the Washington Consensus opposed the government to adopt industry-specific facilitation policy, adopt industrial policy. But if you do not have a government facilitation, it's very hard for the sector which you have competitive advantages to become competitive in the market, to overcome the infrastructure issue or institutional issue. We already mentioned about the need of a facilitation state. But the Washington Consensus opposed that. And the countries which were able to maintain stability and dynamic economic growth, they adopt some kind of piecemeal, gradual, dual-track approach. They continue to provide transitory protection and subsidies to all sectors, which are not viable. But with the government protection and subsidies, they could achieve stability. But they also liberalize the entry to the new sector, which are consistent with their comparative advantages. They are not only liberalize, they facilitate. Like in China, in the 1980s, 1990s, the infrastructure were very poor. But the government set up special economic zone. Within the zone, infrastructure was made good, right? And the business environment at the beginning was very poor also. But within the economic zone, the government provided one-stop services. So the business environment within that zone immediately become very good. Although nationally the infrastructure was poor, business environment was not attractive, but within that zone, infrastructure and business environment are very good. And so that allow the firm to turn from the competitive advantages to competitiveness. And China can grow very dynamically only by that approach. And this approach in the past was considered as the worst possible approach, but it turned out to be the best approach for transition.